A toast turned deadly, and the wineglass told no lies. Welcome to Faded Echoes. I am your host, Ombra. Tell me where you're listening from. Your stories make this one come alive. I always love reading your comments. Let's begin. You can tell a lot about a man by how he knocks on a door. This one came at 11 in the morning, a decisive, no-nonsense thud, followed by a pause that hinted he wasn't used to waiting. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee and wondering if Wolfe would object to me sneaking out to grab lunch somewhere that didn't involve orchids or dictionaries when it hit again. 3 knocks, evenly spaced. Wolfe didn't look up from his desk. He was reading The Wines of the Rhone Valley, which, judging by the grunts I'd heard since breakfast, was either instructive or infuriating him. "Archie," he said without looking up, "there is a sound at the door." "There is," I confirmed. "It's called knocking. Generally means someone wants in." He gave me one of those glances that managed to insult both my intelligence and my upbringing. "Attend to it." I swung open the door and met a man who could have been cut from a wine label, slim, silver-haired, with a European tan and a face that looked cultured right up until you noticed the desperation in the eyes. His suit was perfect, his tie a work of art, and his hand, holding a slim leather case, trembled just enough to show me this visit wasn't social. "Mr. Nero Wolfe?" he asked. I told him he'd hit the jackpot and ushered him in. He introduced himself as Anton Devereaux, owner of Devereaux Imports, specializing in fine European wines and New York egos. "Mr. Wolfe," he began, setting the leather case on the desk like it contained state secrets. "I'm here about an act of treachery." Wolfe's eyes lifted, slow as syrup. "Treachery?" "Yes. Someone has poisoned my reputation, and possibly my wine." That got him. The book closed. Wolfe leaned back, fingers tented. "Your wine?" Devereaux nodded. "A limited batch of 56 Chateau L'Anvers. We were to unveil it at the Metropolitan Club tomorrow evening, but yesterday a sommelier found the aroma altered. Vinegar and something chemical. Sabotage. If this reaches the press, I am ruined." Wolfe's lips compressed. "You suspect a competitor?" "I suspect someone close. Too close. I employ a small circle. Trusted, or so I thought. My assistant, my cellar master, my business partner, my niece, and a critic I have, how shall I say, humored." Archie Goodwin, professional nose for trouble, made a mental note of that list. "Why come to me?" Wolfe asked. "Because," Devereaux said, leaning forward, "the tampering was discovered this morning after I sent a sample bottle here, addressed to you, a gift to tempt your palate." That landed like a dropped corkscrew. I looked at Wolfe. He didn't move, but I could almost hear the machinery start inside that oversized head. "You are suggesting," Wolfe said softly, "that I was the intended recipient of tainted wine?" Devereaux spread his hands. "I cannot say, but the delivery boy was intercepted. The case returned unopened. I believe someone wanted the bottle to reach you, and to make it appear that you, Mr. Wolfe, had received and perhaps endorsed it." I whistled. "Framing you with vinegar, boss. That's a new one." Wolfe closed his eyes briefly, like he was asking the gods why intelligence so often arrived wrapped in idiocy. "Mr. Devereaux," he said finally, "you will leave the bottle here, unopened. You will provide me with the names and particulars of your trusted circle, and you will refrain from public complaint until I instruct you otherwise." Devereaux nodded eagerly. "You will take the case?" Wolfe sighed as if accepting a burden laid upon him by fate and poor human judgment. "I will consider it. Mr. Goodwin will accompany you to your establishment this afternoon. He will observe." And with that, Wolfe turned back to his book, dismissing the man as efficiently as he'd summoned him. When the door closed behind Devereaux, I asked, "So, you're taking it?" Wolfe didn't look up. "I'm defending my cellar, Archie." No man may trespass there, literally or figuratively. That was as close as Nero Wolfe ever got to indignation. I poured myself another cup and grinned. It looked like lunch would have to wait. By the time I got back from seeing Devereaux to his car, Wolfe had already vanished upstairs to his orchids, leaving me alone with a silence thick enough to spread on toast. That was how I knew he was interested. When Wolfe retreats to the plant rooms right after a client leaves, it means he's sorting the man's story into categories: credible, conceivable, and imbecilic. I had a hunch Devereaux landed somewhere between the first two. I used the lull to call Saul Panzer. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he wasn't currently shadowing a husband or a payroll clerk. "Saul," I said, "how's your palate?" "For wine?" "Rotten," he said. "For trouble?" "Depends who's pouring." "Pouring is right. Wolfe's got a case involving a guy named Devereaux. Importer, Class A wardrobe, possibly Class C morals. Someone may have doctored his vino, and one bottle almost had Wolfe's name on it." Saul let out a low whistle. "So they're either gutsy or stupid. Could be both. Stand by. If this thing turns into a hangover, I'll need your nose in a cellar." By 2 o'clock, I was pulling up to Devereaux Imports on East 68th, a building that looked as if it had been carved from old money and new deceit. Inside, polished oak floors met racks of dusty bottles that probably had better pedigrees than most of the customers. Devereaux met me in the foyer, his composure restored to a theatrical calm. "Mr. Goodwin, I've gathered the others as you requested," he said, "though they are uneasy." "Uneasy is a fine condition," I told him. "Keeps people honest." He led me into a tasting room big enough to host a congressional hearing. A long mahogany table dominated the center, lined with glasses and bottles like soldiers waiting for orders. 5 people sat scattered around the table. Devereaux made introductions with the gravitas of a priest reading confessions. First was Miriam Vale, his assistant, early 30s, smart eyes, and a neatness that suggested she ironed her thoughts before speaking them. She gave me a look that said she'd already judged me and found me amusing but unnecessary. Next, Henri Caillot, the cellar master, a stocky Frenchman with a beard like a well-trimmed shrub and hands stained faintly red. He greeted me politely enough, but his eyes flicked to Devereaux with something that wasn't quite respect. Then came Charles Harriman, business partner, tall, trim, and wearing the kind of smile that tries to sell sincerity, wholesale. I pegged him as the money man, the type who counts the corks after a dinner party. Beside him was Lydia Devereaux, the niece, delicate features, anxious hands. She was the sort of girl who looked like she'd apologize for existing. She smiled at me, shyly, then looked down at the table. Finally, Julian Cates, the critic. He was all tweed, arrogance, and cigarette smoke. One of those self-appointed prophets of the palate who could make or break a vineyard with a single adjective. He gave me a nod that said he didn't approve of my shoes or my haircut, but he was willing to tolerate them for now. I leaned against the wall, notebook ready. "All right, folks. Mr. Devereaux tells me one of you might have tried to turn his fine wine into salad dressing. That true, or am I interrupting a social hour?" Harriman bristled. "This is absurd, Goodwin. We're colleagues, not criminals." "Those aren't mutually exclusive," I said. "Tell me, who had access to the 56 Chateau L'Anvers batch?" Henri Caillot snorted. "Who did not?" "I handle the storage." "Mademoiselle Vale records inventory. Monsieur Harriman insists on inspections. Even the critic here wanders our cellars, sniffing like a truffle pig." Cates flicked ash into an empty glass. "I was invited to taste, not to tamper. If your employer cannot tell the difference, perhaps his nose has dulled." Devereaux's hand twitched, but he stayed quiet. I watched Lydia instead. She was staring at the table, lips pressed tight, like she was holding something back. "Miriam," I said, turning to the assistant, When was the last time you saw the batch unspoiled? 3 days ago, she said crisply. Mr. Callett and I inspected it together. The wine was perfect. The next morning it wasn't. And where were you that night? At home, she said, a flicker of irritation in her voice. I have no motive to ruin the company that pays me. Everyone's got a motive, I said. Some are just better hidden. Harriman shifted. Mr. Goodwin, I fail to see the relevance of this inquisition. Perhaps your employer should test the wine himself, if he's so confident. Wolfe doesn't need to taste it, I said. He'll smell the lies from a block away. That earned me a few glares and one half smile from Lydia. I left with my notes full and my head fuller. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe in the office, apparently having resumed his reading. Fritz was setting out a tray, beer, cheese, and an aroma that could make a monk break vows. Well, Wolfe said without looking up. I met your dramatis personae, I said, dropping into the red chair. All the right faces, all the wrong expressions. The cellar master's nervous, the partner's smug, the assistant's hiding something, the critic's drunk on himself, and the niece, well, she's scared of something that hasn't happened yet. Excellent, Wolfe murmured. Did you examine the bottle? It's here, I said, setting the unopened case on his desk. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hiss of carbonation as Fritz poured his beer. Wolfe traced the edge of the seal with a finger, then sniffed the cork through the wood. Curious, he said finally. The seal is genuine, but the aroma, wrong. Someone tampered expertly, then resealed it. This was not clumsy vandalism. It was demonstration. Of what? Intent, Wolfe said. To ruin Devereux, yes, but also to implicate me, however obliquely. An audacious mind, Archie. One that craves validation. Which means... He leaned back, eyes half closed. It means our culprit will make another move soon, one closer to home. You will therefore take precautions. I will not have my household disturbed by theatrics. That was Wolfe's way of saying he expected theatrics. Around 8 that night, as Fritz served braised duckling and Wolfe began expounding on the moral decay of critics, the phone rang. I picked it up. It was Saul. Archie, he said, voice low, you told me to keep my ear out. Well, your wine importer just made the news. Devereux Imports, fire in the cellar. Started half an hour ago. Looks like the whole vintage is gone. I looked at Wolfe. He was staring at me, eyebrows raised slightly like he'd just heard the universe burp. Well, I said, hanging up, looks like the cork's blown off this one. Wolfe's eyes narrowed to slits. Archie, no one destroys a cellar unless they have already bottled the truth elsewhere. That's when I knew he'd just decided to take the case for real. If there's one thing I've learned working for Nero Wolfe, it's that nothing ruins a meal faster than bad news that smells like burnt oak and ambition. Fritz froze mid-slice, knife hovering over the duck, and Wolfe's hand, halfway to his glass, hung there like a suspended verdict. Repeat that, Wolfe said. I did. Slowly. Devereux Imports, cellar fire. Total loss. He exhaled, a long, weary sound. Pfui, predictable. Predictable, I said. A wine cellar goes up in smoke, and that's predictable. Yes, he said. The first act of concealment always fails to satisfy the concealer. Destruction follows, to erase the evidence of their incompetence. I've seen Wolfe chew out millionaires, murderers, and once a city commissioner, but the tone he used then was colder than the beer he didn't finish. He rang for the phone. Call Mr. Devereux, he said. I did, but the line at his office rang into the void. His home number yielded only a harried voice, his niece Lydia, telling me he was at the site and that the fire department hadn't let anyone near the building yet. Wolfe closed his eyes, thinking. I knew what that meant. I'd be the one getting singed next. Archie, he said, you will go there. Observe. Speak to Mr. Devereux if he is capable, and if possible, retrieve any record, ledger, manifest, list that survived. We must know what was destroyed, or rather, what someone wanted destroyed. I grabbed my coat. Fritz looked like he wanted to say something sympathetic, but Wolfe's glare shut him up. By the time I reached East 68th, the street was a carnival of flashing lights, smoke, and city officials shouting orders no one obeyed. The air smelled of charred cork and something metallic underneath, like blood or money. Take your pick. Devereaux stood near a fire engine, coat thrown over his shoulders, face ghost white except for a streak of soot. He saw me and came running, eyes wild. "Mr. Goodwin, it is ruined. All of it. The entire L'Envers batch, the archives, everything." I looked over his shoulder. Firemen were still hauling hoses through the wreckage. Flames had eaten the lower walls like termites with a grudge. "Any injuries?" I asked. "No, thank God. But this is annihilation. Years of work, gone." "Or stolen," I said. Sometimes those words mean the same thing. He stared at me like he hadn't processed that yet. "Who had keys to the building?" I asked. He hesitated. "Myself, Harriman, Callot, and Miriam. She oversees inventory deliveries, but she would never—" "Sure," I said. "And I suppose the critic had a psychic key?" He flinched. "Kate's had no access. He only visited with invitation." "Good. Then I'll assume he wasn't here roasting marshmallows." I slipped past a couple of cops and ducked under the tape, flashing my license in a way that suggested I had more authority than I did. One of the firemen stopped me halfway down the stairwell to the cellar. "Hey, buddy, off limits. Whole floor's unstable." "Sure," I said, "but if I fall in, you can add human interest to your report." That earned me a curse and enough of a distraction to get 3 steps farther before I ducked behind a scorched beam. The cellar was a graveyard. Racks collapsed, bottles shattered, labels curling into black paper ribbons. But fire has a personality. It doesn't burn evenly. It chooses what to consume. And in one corner, untouched by the worst of it, stood a small metal cabinet with a melted lock. I pried it open with a bent pipe. Inside were half a dozen folders, some singed but legible. One was marked Shipment Records, Chateau L'Envers, Private Reserve. Another, Distribution Clients, Pending Consignment. That last one caught my eye. I tucked them into my coat and climbed back out before the floor gave me any ideas about early retirement. Devereaux was arguing with a man I recognized from earlier, Harriman looking immaculate except for a dab of ash on his lapel, like he'd added it for sympathy. "You shouldn't be here," Harriman barked at him. "Insurance will handle this. The authorities—" "Insurance?" Devereaux spat. "I am ruined. Do you speak of compensation when my name—" I cut in. "You boys can argue later. Wolfe will want to see both of you tomorrow at 11. And, Mr. Harriman, bring your records, whatever's left." He stiffened. "I answer to Devereaux, not to your corpulent employer." "Then you'll enjoy explaining that to the police," I said, and walked off before he could reload. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting in the office, as if he'd been there all night. He took the folders from me, laid them out, and examined them with the same reverence most men reserve for sacred scripture. He murmured. "Archie, observe. 2 sets of consignment lists, one for the upcoming event and one, for private sale." "Private sale?" "Yes. The same wine, bottled separately with different serial numbers. Curious, don't you think? Mr. Devereaux was selling the same batch twice." I whistled low. "Insurance fraud?" "Possibly. But consider, the sabotage occurred before the unveiling. Someone wanted to preempt exposure, not profit from it. A partner, perhaps, who feared discovery." "Meaning Harriman." "Meaning I do not assume," he said sharply. "We will summon them all tomorrow. In the meantime, Mr. Devereaux will remain under observation. Saul will oblige." Want me to tell him to park outside the man's house? Indubitably. But do so discreetly. If this culprit has struck twice, he or she will not resist a third. I made the calls, then sat back with a beer, while Wolfe frowned at the folder like it owed him an apology. Around midnight, he finally spoke again. Archie, you will recall that Mr. Devereux mentioned sending a gift bottle here. Yeah, the one that never made it past the delivery boy. He nodded. It is possible the true act of sabotage was not in the cellar, but in the gesture itself. The bottle was intercepted. By whom? The courier service said the package was signed by a M. Vale. Indeed. Miriam Vale. And yet she told you she last saw the batch 3 days before the spoilage, which would make her the first liar in a room full of them. Precisely, Wolfe said, leaning back. Tomorrow we shall see whether Miss Vale enjoys the taste of contradiction. At that moment the doorbell rang. Fritz had long since gone to bed, so I answered it myself. On the stoop stood Saul Panzer, face tight, eyes sharp. Archie, he said, sorry to drop in late. Thought you'd want this. Devereux's car was found 2 blocks from the fire, empty. Driver's door open, engine still warm. I blinked. You mean? Yeah, he said grimly. Devereux's gone. Behind me, Wolfe's voice cut the silence like a blade dipped in ice. Gone, Mr. Panzer? Or removed? Saul shrugged. Depends who wanted him silenced first. Wolfe closed his eyes, folded his hands, and said softly, So, the wine was only the prelude. Now we have the real poison. And just like that, the game had changed from sour grapes to something that smelled a lot like murder. Saul didn't come in. He stood at the threshold, the way men do when they've brought news they'd rather not own. His hat stayed on, his eyes steady, and the streetlight behind him cut a narrow line of white across his cheek. Wolfe didn't move, which for him meant the machinery inside had started grinding faster. Describe, Wolfe said. Saul kept his voice low. Car's a black Bentley, registered to Devereux personally. Found parked behind a deli on 65th, not torched or stripped, just left. Door open, engine running when the beat cop spotted it. No sign of Devereux. No blood, no struggle. Just gone. I said, which means he either walked off or someone made him look like he did. Exactly, Saul said. But there's a wrinkle. The glove compartment had a folder, insurance policies, company correspondence, and a half-empty bottle of that same Chateau L'Envers. Broken seal, fresh cork. Someone opened it recently. Maybe tonight. Wolfe's eyelids drooped half an inch. You have the bottle? Bagged and in my car. I didn't dare carry it here without your word. You will bring it tomorrow morning. Guard it until then. Saul nodded once, gave me a look that said, This one's ugly, and disappeared down the stoop. I shut the door and turned back to Wolfe. All right, I said. We've got missing wine, missing man, and a business that smells like burnt toast. What's next? He took a long, deliberate breath. Sleep, Archie. We cannot deduce on fumes. That was rich, coming from a man whose idea of rest was rearranging thought patterns in alphabetical order, but I didn't argue. The next morning broke gray and slow, like the city wasn't sure it wanted to wake up. By 9, the brownstone was humming. Fritz fussing over breakfast, orchids humming in their tropical trance upstairs, and Wolfe sitting at his desk, glowering at a newspaper headline, Wine Magnate Missing After Fire. An accurate but unilluminating statement, he said. Journalists commit the sin of omission with greater zeal than liars. At 10 sharp, Saul arrived with the bottle. He'd packed it in a padded box, sealed in waxed paper like it was nitroglycerin. I set it on Wolfe's desk. He sniffed without uncorking. Curious, he said. This bottle bears the same lot number as the one sent here, but from a different batch. That suggests duplication. Couldn't Devereux have bottled extras for his secret stash? I asked. Not legally, and certainly not wisely. Duplication implies deception, either financial or personal. In either case, it attracts vermin. He gestured at me with one thick finger. Call the others. 11 o'clock. I will have them all here. Even Devereux. If he is alive, Wolfe said, he will appear. If not, one among them will betray that knowledge. By 10:45, the brownstone was prepped for its usual circus. Chairs set, curtains drawn, beer chilled, because even when summoning suspects, Wolfe insists on comfort. The doorbell began its steady work. First came Miriam Vale, composed as a bank statement. Her suit was immaculate, her voice clipped, and she looked at me like I was an unfortunate rumor. Then Harriman, smirking, confident, a man who believed every word he spoke even when it contradicted the last one. Henri Callot arrived next, looking like he hadn't slept. His eyes darted, his beard unkempt, and the smell of smoke clung to him like guilt. Lydia came last, pale and trembling, clutching a purse that looked too heavy for what it carried. The critic, Julian Cates, was late, naturally. He drifted in at 11:05, muttered something about press obligations, and sat with the offended dignity of a man forced to share oxygen with inferiors. Wolfe ignored them for a full minute, using that silence the way a sculptor uses clay, molding tension until it could stand upright. Then he spoke. Ladies and gentlemen, the man who employed you or entangled you has vanished. His car was found abandoned, his business in ruins. The police will concern themselves with the body. I concern myself with the mind behind it. Harriman scoffed. This is melodrama. We should speak to the authorities, not indulge. Mr. Harriman, Wolfe said, if I required your guidance, I would advertise for it. That shut him down. Now, Wolfe continued, someone here tampered with Devereux's wine. That same someone orchestrated the fire. Whether Mr. Devereux's disappearance was murder, flight, or abduction, it was the inevitable next step in a design begun days ago. I intend to reveal it, but first, Mr. Goodwin will clarify certain details. I took the cue. Right, here's what we know. A sample bottle was sent to Wolfe, intercepted before delivery. The cellar burned, but records show duplicate lot numbers for a limited reserve. Same batch listed twice. Once for the Metropolitan event, once for private sale. Somebody was cooking books, and when the stew boiled over, they tossed in a match. Cates chuckled dryly. How poetic. But if you're implying I'd waste vintage for sabotage, you've misread me. I only destroy reputations, not beverages. Fine, I said. Then you'll be glad to know yours is safe. For now. Miriam spoke next, voice icy. If you think this circus absolves your client, you're mistaken. Mr. Devereux was ambitious, secretive. He could have started this himself to cover debt. Wolfe interlaced his fingers. And yet you intercepted his gift to me. Her eyes snapped up. What? The courier record, Wolfe said, bears your signature. You received the package meant for me. You claimed you hadn't seen the batch since the day before the sabotage. Why the discrepancy? Miriam faltered, color rising. Devereux told me to intercept it. He said he changed his mind, that the shipment wasn't suitable. Indeed, Wolfe murmured. And yet you neither informed him of the later spoilage nor reported the interception when questioned. Why? She bit her lip. Because I thought he'd overreact. He trusted me to handle it quietly. Loyalty masquerading as deceit. Very common among subordinates in love. Her cheeks flushed crimson. That's ridiculous. Is it? You were loyal enough to forge his name on correspondence 2 weeks ago. Mr. Goodwin found the signature discrepancies in the consignment folders. That cracked her composure. Her hands tightened on her purse. All right, she said. Yes, I signed for him. He was negotiating privately with a French distributor, and he wanted it off the books. but I had nothing to do with the fire or his disappearance. Perhaps not directly, Wolfe said, but your concealment enabled another. Mr. Harriman, perhaps? Harriman smiled thinly. If I wanted the business, I wouldn't burn it. Precisely, Wolfe said. You'd insure it. The man flinched. Wolfe leaned forward. The dual shipment records suggest that the reserve was sold twice. Once legitimately, once fraudulently. Only the financial partner could accomplish that. Devereaux must have discovered it. Harriman's eyes darkened. That's nonsense. Is it? Wolfe's voice hardened. The fire was meant to destroy proof, the physical stock and ledgers. But Mr. Goodwin retrieved enough to show overlapping consignment numbers. You, sir, had motive, means, and opportunity. Harriman opened his mouth, then froze as the front doorbell rang. I stood. Wolfe held up a hand. Let it ring. We waited. It rang again, longer this time. Finally, Wolfe nodded, and I went to answer. When I opened the door, I almost forgot how to talk. Anton Devereaux stood there, alive, but barely. His suit was torn, face bruised, hair matted. He swayed on his feet like a man who'd walked out of a dream he didn't like. Mr. Goodwin, he gasped. I must speak to Wolfe. Now. I caught him before he collapsed and half-dragged, half-carried him into the office. The room went still. Wolfe's eyes flicked open wider than I'd seen in years. Mr. Devereaux, you've been absent. Devereaux looked around the room, spotted Harriman, and his voice cracked into a rasp. He tried to kill me. Harriman shot up, shouting, Lies! But Wolfe's voice sliced through it. Archie, he said calmly, shut the door. I did, and the sound of the latch clicking was the kind of punctuation that means a chapter's about to end badly for someone. Devereaux slumped into the chair opposite Wolfe, breathing raggedly. He found out. Harriman found out I planned to expose him. He had me taken from my car. His men left me in a warehouse by the docks. I escaped when the fire drew the police away. I came straight here. Harriman blustered. This is madness. Wolfe raised a hand. Mr. Harriman, silence is your only defense left. Use it wisely. And then, turning to me, he said in that low, deliberate tone that always means the air's about to tighten. Archie, please call Inspector Kramer. Inform him that Nero Wolfe has a guest, alive, and another ready for custody. I looked at Devereaux. Pale, trembling, eyes full of something between triumph and terror, and thought, not for the first time, that Wolfe's definition of peace and mine lived on opposite ends of the same wine bottle. Devereaux's confession didn't come out as much as it leaked, thin, ragged, broken between gasps. I'd seen men in worse shape, but not many who'd made it as far as our front door under their own steam. Fritz came running with a glass of water and a towel, but Wolfe waved him back. His eyes were locked on Devereaux with that peculiar combination of detachment and precision, like a man watching a rare insect struggling under glass. You will speak clearly, Wolfe said, from the moment you left your establishment last night. Devereaux wiped his mouth and nodded. I was heading home. After calling the fire department, after everything was gone, my car was stopped 2 blocks from the office. A man approached, one of Harriman's warehouse workers. I recognized him. He said Mr. Harriman wanted to see me privately to discuss the insurance. I was foolish enough to go. Harriman jumped up again, shouting, That's absurd. My men wouldn't. Sit down. Wolfe's voice cracked like a whip. If you interrupt again, I shall summon the inspector for a second charge. Disorderly stupidity. Harriman froze, half standing, then sank back into his chair. Devereaux went on. They took me to a warehouse near the river. I was struck, blindfolded, kept there through the night. I heard voices, muffled. They were arguing. One wanted to finish me. The other said it wasn't necessary. Then the fire engines. Sirens. They panicked. I crawled out when they left. I came here. I didn't know where else. Wolfe's eyes flicked toward me. Archie, record the address of this warehouse. You and Mr. Panzer will verify his account. I said, sure, assuming our friend here doesn't bleed out before we get confirmation. Devereaux gave a thin, bitter smile. I am not dying, Mr. Goodwin, merely embarrassed to still be alive. Then do try to remain that way, Wolfe said. Inspector Kramer will expect a coherent statement. Kramer arrived an hour later, and he was in fine form. He didn't like being summoned to the brownstone at the best of times. Having to hear a half-conscious wine importer accuse his partner of attempted murder didn't sweeten his mood. He barreled in with Sergeant Pearlie Stebbins at his heels, gave Wolfe a glare, gave me another, and barked, "You've got nerve, Wolfe. Every time I think you've retired into obscurity, you hatch another circus act." Wolfe merely inclined his head. "Inspector, I'm gratified by your punctuality. Mr. Devereaux has survived what appears to be an abduction engineered by his partner, Mr. Harriman, whose guilt is as evident as his insolence." "Yeah?" Kramer said. "We'll see about that." He turned on Harriman. "You got anything to say before I haul you in?" Harriman went pale, but kept his composure. "Only that I'm being framed by a man desperate to hide his own fraud. Devereaux cooked his books. He used me as a front for illegal resales. When I found out, he panicked and set the fire himself. Now he's turning it around." "Convenient," I said. "You get to be both victim and hero." Kramer rubbed his chin, looking from one to the other. "We'll sort it out downtown. Stebbins, take him." Harriman's mask cracked then. His eyes darted toward Miriam Vale, and she looked away, quick and nervous. Not guilt exactly, but the kind of fear that knows more than it wants to. I filed that for later. When the cops had gone, dragging Harriman and a pair of statements with them, Wolfe exhaled through his nose. The man is guilty, but not solely. This has an odor of conspiracy. A lone schemer does not burn evidence so recklessly. "You think Miriam's in on it?" I asked. He tapped a finger on the arm of his chair. "She concealed the interception of the bottle, forged documents, and lied by omission. Yet she displays fear, not cunning. Fear implies dependency. If not Harriman, then another holds her tether." "Cates?" I suggested. "He's got the temperament for blackmail and a fondness for tragedy." "Perhaps, but he lacks purpose. Critics destroy reputations with words, not fire. Still, we must verify." I called Saul, who was still at the warehouse site. "It's legit," he said. "Found Devereaux's shoe, blood on the floor, ropes cut with a blade. Neighbors report a truck leaving around 2 a.m. No one's talking. Want me to trail anyone?" "Yeah," I said. "Keep an eye on Miss Vale. See who she meets when she thinks she's alone." Back in the office, Lydia was sitting silently, hands clasped, eyes red. Wolfe turned to her. "Miss Devereaux, your uncle's business affairs, were you aware of any irregularities?" She shook her head. "No, he was proud, secretive. But lately he was frightened. He said someone was watching him. I thought it was paranoia." "Not entirely," Wolfe said. "You will remain here until Mr. Panzer confirms his findings. Mr. Goodwin will see to your comfort." I got her settled in the front room with tea. She tried to thank me, but her voice broke halfway through. When I came back, Wolfe was staring at the uncorked bottle Saul had brought earlier, its deep red glinting under the lamplight. "Curious," he murmured. "Archie, note the residue near the neck. This is no mere spoilage." "Smell." I did. The odor hit sharp and metallic, not vinegar, but something sourer, chemical. "Not your usual dinner wine," I said. He nodded. "An additive. Likely methanol or similar, used to simulate aging or alter flavor. Crude but effective in small quantities. However, in this concentration, it would render the wine undrinkable. A deliberate corruption. To wreck the brand. Or to discredit its maker. Remember, the tampered sample was addressed to me. The intent was humiliation, not profit. So Harriman wanted to ruin Devereaux, make him look like a fraud. Perhaps, or someone else wished to ruin them both. He leaned back, eyes half-lidded. That little hum he makes when the pieces start dancing into place. I knew better than to interrupt. 2 hours later, Saul called again. "You'll like this," he said. Vale met Cates at a cafe downtown. They talked 15 minutes, left separately. I followed her. She went to a safety deposit box at First Manhattan Bank. Small one. Came out empty-handed, nervous. "Nice work," I said. "Stay close." I relayed it to Wolfe, who actually smiled. A faint curve, but in his world, that's like fireworks. "Excellent. We shall invite Miss Vale to return tomorrow." With candor. It was after dinner when the second act of this melodrama arrived, wrapped in a sharp knock at the door. I opened it to find Kate standing there, hat in hand, eyes darting like a man deciding whether to run or confess. "I need to see Mr. Wolfe," he said. "Alone." "That's not how this works," I told him, but Wolfe's voice drifted from the office. "Let him in, Archie." Cates stepped inside, tense and sweating. He looked around like the furniture might take notes. "I'm not proud of what I've done," he said quickly. "But I didn't burn anything, and I didn't kidnap anyone. I just helped move a few bottles." "Ah," Wolfe said. "The private sales. You facilitated the deception?" "Yes," Cates muttered. "Harriman paid me to write favorable reviews before the unveiling, in exchange for an early cut of the proceeds. I thought it was harmless. But then the wine was tampered with and Devereaux found out. He threatened to expose us all. Harriman lost control." "All?" Wolfe asked softly. "Who else was involved?" Cates hesitated, then said, "Miriam. She forged the papers under Harriman's instructions. She thought it was just to correct bookkeeping errors. When she realized the scale, she panicked. Harriman promised he'd take care of it. She didn't know that meant fire." Wolfe closed his eyes briefly, a sound halfway between a sigh and a growl escaping his throat. "Greed," he said. "The cheapest motive and the most expensive to clean up." Cates looked miserable. "You'll tell the police?" "I will tell the truth," Wolfe said. "Whether you survive its effects is not my concern." Cates swallowed hard, then left without another word. When the door closed, Wolfe finally turned to me. "Tomorrow morning, we will summon them all again. Miss Vale, Mr. Cates, and Mr. Devereaux. The critic has broken, the assistant will confirm, and the importer will supply the final nail. And Harriman. Inspector Kramer will have extracted his own confession by dawn. I merely intend to provide the proper punctuation," I said, meaning another grand performance in the office. He gave me a slow nod. "Exactly. The stage is set. The wine has breathed. Tomorrow, Archie, we shall taste justice." Morning in the brownstone has a rhythm. Fritz hums in the kitchen like an industrious bee, the orchids whisper above in their humid palace, and Wolfe settles behind his desk, transforming breakfast into a tactical exercise in eggs and deduction. But that morning, the rhythm was off. Wolfe barely touched his griddle cakes, and when Wolfe neglects food, you know the world's about to wobble. He sat staring into the steam of his coffee, muttering, "A man who burns his fortune rarely acts alone. There is always an arsonist of the mind before the one of the match." I'd been going through Saul's latest notes, Vale's safety deposit box visit and the cafe rendezvous with Cates, and waiting for Wolfe to stop philosophizing long enough to deliver instructions. When he didn't, I said, "You still think someone else is pulling the strings?" He looked up, eyes half hidden behind those heavy lids. "I'm certain, but we require confirmation. Today, Archie, we shall extract it." At 10 sharp, the phone rang. It was Kramer. His voice was pure gravel. "Wolfe, I hope you're not planning to play courtroom again." "Harriman cracked at dawn. We've got enough to hold him for fraud, arson, and attempted murder. Wolfe grunted, a sound that could mean triumph or mild dyspepsia. He named accomplices? None that stuck. He's blaming everyone but the Virgin Mary. Vale, Cates, Devereux, you name it. I'm sending a man to pick up Vale for questioning. That will not be necessary, Wolfe said. She will be here within the hour of her own volition. When she leaves, you may collect the proper confession. Kramer swore softly. You and your puppet shows? All right, but if you sit on evidence again, I'll— Inspector, Wolfe interrupted. Spare me your indignation. It wastes calories. He hung up, leaving me to catch the aftertaste of Kramer's mood. You sure it's wise to summon Vale and Cates here with Devereux under the same roof? I rely on human nature, Archie. Guilt seeks recognition. Today, I shall oblige it. By 11, the office was ready. Chairs aligned like pews, files stacked with surgical precision, and the tainted bottle gleaming on the desk like a confession in glass. Fritz had brewed fresh coffee, which, under the circumstances, seemed optimistic. Miriam Vale arrived first. She looked less like the brisk professional from before and more like a woman who'd spent the night expecting a knock on the door. The tension had carved faint lines under her eyes. Then came Cates, a bundle of nerves in a tweed shell, clutching his hat like it was the last prop in a tragic play. Devereux followed, slower, gaunter, a strip of gauze on his temple, his pride the only thing holding him upright. Wolfe motioned them to sit. We shall begin, he said simply, with truth. He turned to Miriam first. Miss Vale, you forged signatures, concealed a package, and maintained silence while others burned for your omissions. Explain yourself. Her composure cracked. I didn't know how far it would go. Harriman told me the duplicate shipments were just financial adjustments. He said Mr. Devereux had debts, and it was harmless. An accounting trick. When I realized he'd sold the same reserve twice, I confronted him. He laughed. He said Devereux would never dare expose him because it would ruin them both. Devereux let out a bitter laugh. And he was right, until he overplayed his hand. Wolfe's gaze shifted to him. You were aware of the duplication? Devereux hesitated. I discovered it 2 days before the sabotage. I confronted Harriman. He begged for time to correct the records. I gave him 1 day. The next, the wine was spoiled. So you intended exposure, Wolfe said. But your hesitation gave him opportunity. Your scruple nearly killed you. Perhaps, Devereux said quietly. But I would not have believed him capable of fire or of that warehouse. Capability, Wolfe said, is often underestimated by those who rely on refinement to disguise desperation. Cates cleared his throat. If you'll allow me, I can corroborate some of this. Harriman recruited me. He wanted advance praise in my column to inflate value before the auction. I played along. But when Devereux discovered the duplicates, Harriman panicked. He told me the critic would take the fall for faulty storage if the wine turned bad. Said I'd be ruined unless I kept quiet. You participated in the corruption, Wolfe said, and now offer contrition as currency. I'm not proud of it, Cates said, his voice cracking. But I didn't know about the arson. No, Wolfe said softly. You lack the courage, or the will. Both are rarities in your profession. For a moment the room was silent except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. Then Wolfe shifted, slowly, his bulk turning toward the desk where the tainted bottle gleamed like a ruby with bad intentions. This, he said, touching the neck lightly, was the fulcrum of the plot, not the fire, not the fraud. This, he gestured to me. Archie, the label. I handed it over. Wolfe peeled back a corner, revealing a faint watermark, an interlocked pair of initials. A.D. Anton Devereux, he said. You designed your own label, naturally. And yet this bottle's watermark is inverted, backward as if printed from a forged plate. Tell me, Mr. Devereux, who handles your branding? He blinked. Harriman arranged that. Through a print supplier. Indeed. And the supplier's invoices in your files? List your assistant's countersignature. Miss Vale, you authorized payment? She nodded. Harriman told me to. Wolfe's lips curved. Precisely. Harriman forged your wine, counterfeited your own label to produce fake duplicates, which he then sold privately. When you discovered it, he corrupted the batch and attempted to destroy the evidence. But someone else, someone cleverer, intervened. Cates frowned. Someone else? Yes, Wolfe said. The fire was sloppy, desperate. But the tampered bottle, that was art. Its purpose was not to destroy, but to lure. It was sent to me to ensure exposure. Someone wanted me involved, to force this into light. Only one among you knew both my distaste for fraud and my access to publicity. He turned his gaze fully on Miriam Vale. Her face went white. I didn't mean... You tampered with the bottle, Wolfe said. You replaced its contents with spoiled wine mixed with preservative to ensure it would be noticed but not dangerous. You sent it here under Devereux's name. You hoped I would trace it, expose Harriman, and spare yourself from being implicated directly. A neat stratagem, if one lacked moral courage. Tears welled up. I only wanted it to stop, she whispered. Harriman threatened me. He said if I talked, he'd tell Devereux I'd helped with the forgery. I thought if you found the truth, it would end without blood. Yet it ended with fire, Wolfe said. I didn't know, she said, voice breaking. He said he'd just destroy the extra stock, not the whole cellar. Devereux's hands tightened into fists. You betrayed me, Miriam. You... Wolfe raised a hand. Enough. You, Mr. Devereux, are culpable as well. Your vanity, your secrecy, and your willingness to let deceit run its course made this possible. Miss Vale acted from fear, Harriman from greed, Cates from ambition, and you, sir, from arrogance. All of you drank from the same bottle. No one spoke. Wolfe leaned back, folded his hands, and said quietly, Inspector Kramer will take your statements. He will find enough there to prosecute the fraud, the arson, and the abduction. The rest, your moral debts, are beyond his jurisdiction. He rang for Fritz. Archie, please summon the inspector. While I made the call, the room sat in silence. Miriam stared at the floor. Cates rubbed his temples. Devereux looked as though he'd been hollowed out. When Kramer arrived, he took one look at the lineup and muttered, I should just move my desk here. He listened, grunted in all the right places, and when he left with Miriam and Cates in tow, Devereux rose, shaky but upright. You've saved my life, Wolfe, he said quietly, though I'm not sure what's left to live for. That, Wolfe said, reaching for his beer, is not my concern. Preserve your remaining decency, and you may yet ferment into something drinkable. When the door finally shut and the silence settled again, Wolfe sighed, deep and satisfied, as though the air had finally cleared of vinegar. Archie, he said, have Fritz prepare the 45 Burgundy. The palate must be reminded that corruption, though common, is not universal. I poured his glass and one for myself. You know, I said, you could have just told them to stop lying instead of hosting another confessional. He gave me a look over the rim of his glass. Archie, if truth were ever offered freely, my profession would be extinct. And with that, he sipped, closed his eyes, and let the taste finish the conversation. Dinner that night was quieter than usual, and that's saying something in a house where conversation generally gets treated like an unwanted draft. Wolfe was back to normal, by which I mean he was irritable, pompous, and making noises about mental fatigue that would make a saint crave noise. Fritz had put out roasted capon with rosemary potatoes, and while Wolfe praised it with the restraint of a pope issuing a benediction, I could tell he was still chewing on something besides poultry. He didn't talk much through the meal, but when he set down his fork and reached for his beer, he finally said, Archie, deceit rarely ends with exposure. It ends with revelation. They are not the same. Meaning? I asked, because with Wolfe you have to pull the thread or he'll let it dangle just to watch you squirm. Meaning, he said, that what we saw today was confession, not comprehension. They admitted guilt, yes, but they do not yet understand the measure of their folly. Until they do, I am not done. That sounds like a man planning a sequel, I said. He grunted. Pfui, merely a coda. I let it rest there until the next morning. Kramer called at 9, sounding like a man whose ulcer had filed for emancipation. Wolfe, he barked, your little wine club's turned into a madhouse. Harriman tried to hang himself in his cell last night. Didn't succeed, but he's not talking anymore. Vale's corroborated most of it. Cates has been crying into his lawyer, and Devereaux's threatening to sue half the city for conspiracy. You sure you don't want to start charging admission for these things? Inspector, Wolfe said evenly, if I charged for folly, you could not afford my rates. Kramer cursed under his breath, muttered something about subpoenas, and hung up. Wolfe didn't even blink. He was already thinking 3 moves ahead. By mid-morning, the brownstone had settled back into its version of peace. Fritz was upstairs rearranging orchids for delivery, and Wolfe was behind his desk, dictating notes to me in that measured monotone that could hypnotize a caffeinated accountant. But as I wrote, I couldn't shake the feeling that the case wasn't quite corked. Something still fizzed beneath the surface. Boss, I said, you don't look satisfied. You've got your confessions, your culprit, your moral commentary. What's missing? He looked up, the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth. A pattern, Archie. It does not fit. Harriman was greedy, yes, but greed rarely leads to self-destruction. He acted not as a man preserving profit, but one concealing something deeper. You think there's another secret hidden in all that wine? Not in the wine, Wolfe said softly. In the fire. That was all it took to put me back in motion. Wolfe didn't need to say it outright. I knew he wanted me at the scene again, turning over ashes while he stayed seated, conquering the case through geometry and vocabulary. Saul met me there an hour later, leaning against his car with that unbothered calm that makes you wonder if he was born in a fedora. The building was still cordoned off, though the fire department had declared it stable. The air smelled of wet soot and melted varnish. Morning, Archie, Saul said. You're late for a funeral. Yeah, I said. Let's dig up a ghost. We picked through what was left of the lower floor. Most of the cellar was charred beyond recognition, but a few iron racks had survived in warped shapes. I was about to call it a wash when Saul said, Over here. He pointed to a section of floor where the wood was darker, not burned, but wet. A square panel, half hidden under debris. Together, we pried it open. Beneath was a small fireproof compartment lined with metal. Inside were 2 things, a ledger and a stack of envelopes sealed with wax. The ledger was scorched around the edges but readable. The entries weren't about shipments. They were payments. Regular ones, large and labeled only, with initials RV and MV. I felt my stomach drop. Miriam Vale, I said. RV. Richard Vale. Saul raised a brow. You mean her brother, the one who disappeared 5 years ago? Yeah, I said. He ran Devereaux's European accounts before he vanished. They said he drowned on a business trip. Saul nodded slowly. Maybe he didn't. We didn't open the envelopes there. I brought them back to the brownstone, and Wolfe had Fritz bring a tray like he was about to dissect a royal scandal, which, knowing him, wasn't far off. He broke the wax on one of the envelopes and unfolded the papers inside. His eyes flicked left and right, the way they do when his brain starts to outpace English. Then he exhaled, heavy and deliberate. Well, he said, it seems Mr. Harriman was not merely a swindler. He was a smuggler. Smuggling what? Wine? No, Wolfe said, tapping the papers. Art. Specifically, European antiquities disguised as wine shipments. Devereux's firm was the perfect vessel, respectable, discreet, international. Harriman and a silent partner financed the scheme. The initials R.V., Richard Vale, alive and evidently complicit. That means Miriam's been paying off her own brother, I said. To keep quiet. To keep him hidden, Wolfe corrected. He was the true architect. Harriman was his stateside proxy. When the counterfeit shipments began to unravel, Harriman tried to cover their tracks, but Richard, wherever he is, wouldn't allow exposure. The fire destroyed evidence that could have led to him. And Miriam, an accomplice turned custodian. She believed she was protecting her family, but the weight of secrecy corrodes faster than guilt. I looked at the envelopes. You think she knows her brother's alive? She knows enough, Wolfe said, but perhaps not that he still profits from her silence. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. Archie, call Mr. Panzer. I want Miss Vale brought here discreetly. Do not inform the police. Yet. When Miriam arrived 2 hours later, she looked drained, like she'd been running from herself since dawn. Wolfe greeted her with an odd gentleness that only meant one thing. The game was almost over. Miss Vale, he began, we discovered documents that complicate your absolution. Payments made to an RV, your brother. Her breath caught, and the color drained from her face. You found them? Indeed. I will not ask where he is yet, but you will tell me what he has done. Tears pooled, but she didn't speak right away. When she did, her voice was barely a whisper. He was supposed to be dead, but 3 years ago he wrote to me. He said he'd escaped prosecution in France and needed money to disappear for good. I sent him what I could. Harriman found out. He used it to control me. If I told anyone, he'd expose Richard and me both. Your brother orchestrated the smuggling? Yes. Harriman handled the shipping, Richard the sourcing. When it fell apart, Harriman turned desperate. I thought the fire would be the end, but Richard wrote again last month. He said someone was watching him. He wanted more money. I refused. Wolfe's eyes closed halfway and his tone turned sharp as steel. Then he, not Harriman, spoiled the wine. The sabotage drew attention away from his financial trail, forcing Harriman to panic and burn the evidence. Your brother began this, Miss Vale. Harriman merely tried and failed to end it. She buried her face in her hands. I never wanted this. I thought I was saving him. Wolfe's voice softened again, though the words stayed heavy. You cannot preserve a man by feeding his decay. The law will determine his fate. But if you wish to salvage your own conscience, you will give Inspector Kramer his location. Through tears, she nodded. He's in Montreal? Under the name René Valcourt. Wolfe leaned back, a quiet satisfaction creeping into his eyes. Montreal, he murmured. How fitting. A city where guilt can age in barrels. I made the call to Kramer, who took the news with a growl that could have cracked granite. He said he'd alert Interpol and hung up before I could congratulate him. When I turned back, Wolfe was staring at the now empty envelope, his voice thoughtful. A pity, Archie. The rarest wines and the rarest men share a flaw. They spoil if not stored properly. That your way of saying justice needs a good cellar? He smirked faintly. No, that's my way of saying decency should never be bottled for profit. Fritz appeared with the evening tray just then, saving me from trying to top that. Wolfe raised his glass, eyes glinting over the rim. To human folly, he said. I clinked mine against his. It keeps us employed, I said. And for once, he didn't disagree. The next morning, the brownstone felt heavier than usual, as if the air itself had been soaking up the weight of other people's guilt all night. Wolfe didn't come down for breakfast until after 10, which meant the orchids had received more wisdom than I had in the last 12 hours. When he finally appeared, he was dressed in his gray suit, the one he wears when the game's over but the paperwork isn't, and he looked like a man still digesting both the capon and the consequences. Montreal, he said, as if the word itself were a sour note. A city of cold truths. I looked up from the morning paper. You sound disappointed. I thought you'd be pleased that the case wrapped up neatly for once. Kramer's chasing Richard Vale north, Devereux's free to cry into his ledger, and the lady assistant can start sewing remorse into pillowcases. Neatly? Wolfe's eyebrows rose an inch. Archie, no case involving human deceit concludes neatly. It concludes conveniently. Fine, I said. Conveniently, then. The law's happy, the newspapers are thrilled, and I get a day without tailing anyone through wine cellars that smell like burnt grapes. Why spoil the ending? He didn't answer right away. He was buttering toast with surgical precision, but his eyes were somewhere else. Because something still offends reason, he said finally. Mr. Vale's resurrection is plausible. His sister's complicity, regrettable but explicable. Yet Harriman's attempt at self-destruction disturbs me. Guilt, yes, but not despair. He feared something. Like extradition, I offered. Or the thought of facing you again. Pfui, Wolfe said. He feared exposure of a different nature. There was a second ledger, Archie. One I did not find. You're sure? Quite. He leaned back, his eyes narrowing. Harriman managed the domestic front of the smuggling operation. Vale handled the sourcing, but someone managed the flow between them. The intermediary, the true broker, remains unaccounted for, and it was he, not Harriman, who ordered the fire. Got a name? I asked. He took a sip of coffee. Not yet. But if Mr. Vale reached Montreal unimpeded, he did not go alone. There will be correspondence. Then I'll check with Kramer. Maybe they picked something off Vale's trail. You will not call Kramer, Wolfe said sharply. You will wire the Canadian Pacific office directly. Request a passenger manifest from the last evening train to Montreal. Have Saul assist. Mr. Vale may have changed his name, but his companion will have left traces. I gave him a mock salute. The Great Northern paper chase, coming right up. By noon, Saul was at the telegraph office, and by 2 we had our reply. Wolfe read it once, and a slow, dark satisfaction crept over his face. There, he said, tapping a name near the bottom. Miss Lydia Devereux. That caught me off guard. The niece? You think she went with Vale? I know she did, Wolfe said. Her sympathy was too intense, her silence too deliberate. She was the bridge between Devereux's fortune and Vale's resurrection. When her uncle refused to aid her brother, she turned to Harriman for help. He financed Richard's disappearance with Devereux's assets, disguised as business expenses. When the fraud began to crumble, she watched it burn. Holy smoke, I said. So the quiet niece is the invisible broker. Wolfe nodded, eyes gleaming. Yes, and now she flees with her uncle's fortune and her brother's ruin. Poetic symmetry, disgusting but efficient. Before I could respond, the phone rang. It was Kramer again, and this time his voice was as raw as gravel dragged through sand. Goodwin, get Wolfe. You were right about Vale. Montreal police picked him up this morning. He was shot outside his hotel. Dead. I froze. Shot? By who? They're saying robbery, but I don't buy it. No wallet, no papers, but a ticket stub for a passenger named L. Devereux. Train to Toronto, 8:45 a.m. Guess she didn't wait for breakfast. I hung up slowly. Wolfe was watching me. Well, he said. Vale's dead. Shot last night. Lydia's missing. Train to Toronto. For a moment, Wolfe didn't move. Then very quietly he said, Fate has a flair for symmetry. She silenced the brother to preserve herself. And yet she will not reach Toronto. You think she'll be caught? I think, Wolfe said, that she has already surrendered. To inevitability. He leaned forward. Archie, call Kramer. Tell him to have the Toronto police meet the train. Miss Devereux will be in the last car, left compartment. She will not resist arrest. I stared. You sure about that? Quite. A woman capable of orchestrating smuggling, deception, and fratricide is still a creature of sentiment. She will have kept one memento, likely the wax seal from the forged envelopes. It will identify her to the conductor. She would not discard it. Vanity never does. I made the call. Kramer didn't even argue this time, just grunted and said he'd relay it north. It was close to 6 that evening when the confirmation came. The call from Toronto lasted less than a minute. They found her exactly as Wolfe predicted, in the rear compartment, sitting by the window with the wax seal in her lap. She hadn't made it to the border. A small vial of laudanum lay beside her. When I hung up, the silence in the office was thicker than ever. Wolfe didn't ask what I'd heard. He already knew. He just sat there, staring at the glass of beer in front of him, untouched. After a while, I said, "That's it then. Curtain down." "On this act," Wolfe murmured, "human folly, Archie, does not conclude. It merely migrates." He lifted the glass, finally, but didn't drink. A woman who poisons herself to escape the consequences of poison. Poetic, if one were inclined to admire stupidity. She probably thought she was saving him, I said. "Perhaps," he said, "but salvation obtained through destruction is counterfeit virtue. Like bad wine, it promises flavor, but delivers only acid." He rose, which was rare enough to make the room hold its breath. He walked to the window and looked out at the grey street. "In this case, Archie, no one was innocent, not even the wine. Corruption seeped into everything it touched." "Still," I said, "you brought it to light." He turned, the faintest curve touching his mouth. "No, I merely uncorked it. The flavor was theirs." Fritz appeared in the doorway then, carrying the evening tray, a fresh bottle of Burgundy and 2 glasses. Wolfe took it, poured carefully, and handed me one. "To the tainted wine," he said softly. I raised my glass, "and to the man who refused to drink it." For a moment, the clink of glass was the only sound. The city murmured faintly outside, the orchids breathed upstairs, and Wolfe sat back, down, content, composed, and heavier with knowing. He took a slow sip, savoring it like truth itself. "Archie," he said finally, "you see how easily men spoil what they love, how quickly purity turns sour in their hands. The world intoxicates itself on ambition and calls it taste." "Maybe," I said, "but sometimes it takes a stubborn man with a big chair and a better palate to tell the difference." That earned me the rarest thing of all, a low chuckle from Wolfe. He leaned back, satisfied, his voice drifting like smoke. "Indeed, Archie. And in that lies both our profession and our damnation." Outside, the wind rattled against the window panes, and inside, the last of the Burgundy caught the light. It glowed deep and red and calm, untouched by deceit. Dinner was ready, the case was closed, and the brownstone, at last, exhaled. The days after the Devereux affair drifted by with the kind of deceptive calm that makes a man uneasy. Wolfe buried himself in his orchids, which meant he was brooding. Fritz hummed around the kitchen like a man trying to fill a silence too big for one household, and I spent my time reading the papers, half expecting the headlines to sprout new thorns. They didn't. Montreal confirmed Lydia Devereux's death. Interpol traced Richard Vale's network to a smuggling ring that stretched from Marseille to Quebec, and Kramer collected enough credit to last him through the next city budget hearing. Everyone had their closure, except Wolfe. He didn't mention the case for 3 days, which was his way of letting it ferment in silence. Then, on the 4th morning, I found him in the office at an hour that would normally qualify as ungodly. He was reading a letter sealed with official stationery, the sort of thing that usually gives him hives. "From Kramer?" I asked. "From the Department of Justice," he said, without looking up. "They request clarification of my involvement in the Devereux investigation." An irksome phrase, since involvement implies voluntarism. "So they want to know how a private detective unraveled an international smuggling ring from his chair," I said. I'd call that flattery. Flattery is simply the first course before interference, Wolfe muttered. They are sending a representative this afternoon. That bit of news deserved a reaction, but I'd run out of ways to express disbelief where government interest was concerned. I poured myself coffee instead. Any idea what they want besides paperwork? He looked up then, eyes glinting. Verification, and perhaps acquisition. Of what? Me, Archie, he said with mock disgust. They intend to recruit my methods for bureaucratic use. I find the notion repellent. I grinned. The government trying to hire you. They might as well ask the Sphinx to file reports. He snorted, which was his way of agreeing without conceding humor. At 3 o'clock sharp, a dark sedan pulled up, outside. A man in his 40s stepped out, wearing a federal suit and the kind of smile that knew it didn't belong here. He introduced himself as Special Agent Paul Denning. He had a calm, smooth way of talking that made you feel like you'd already signed something you hadn't read. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, shaking hands with just the right amount of grip. "You've done the Bureau a service, whether you intended to or not. The Devereaux case uncovered channels we've been tracking for years." Wolfe nodded slightly. "You are welcome to the residue of human folly I dredge up. It accumulates quickly enough." Denning smiled. "We're not here for residue. We're here because one of the seized ledgers references an American buyer, codename Lionel. It appears he financed several shipments through Vale's network. We traced part of that funding to a domestic account in New York. The trail ends abruptly. Here. That got my attention." "Here? You mean in the city?" Denning's eyes flicked toward me. "In the same banking district that handles Mr. Wolfe's accounts, actually. Coincidence, I'm sure." Wolfe's brows drew together like storm clouds gathering. "Inspector, you insult my intelligence and your own profession simultaneously. You're implying that I—" "Not you," Denning interrupted smoothly. "Your late client, Mr. Anton Devereaux. He received large transfers from this same account over a 2-year period, which means he may not have been as innocent as he seemed." That hung in the air like the smell of cheap cologne. I said, "Devereaux's dead. His business is ashes. What's left to prove?" Denning shrugged. "We don't assume guilt ends with the man. If he was involved, someone else may have inherited his position, or his debt." Wolfe leaned back, eyes closing. "You are suggesting the operation persists?" "I'm saying it evolves," Denning said. "Vale's death in Montreal wasn't the finale you think it was. 2 other names on the ledger disappeared last month, an art broker in Lisbon and a shipping clerk in Brooklyn. Both untraceable. We believe whoever orchestrated the financing is still active. If Devereaux wasn't just a pawn, we may have another player still inside the city." Wolfe didn't move, but his voice cooled a few degrees. "And you expect me to find this phantom financier?" "I'd call it a favor," Denning said. "You have reach where we have procedure." "Pfui," Wolfe muttered. "Procedure is simply organized impotence." Denning smiled like a man who'd expected that. "If it's any incentive, the Bureau can offer complete access to the case records, unredacted. Names, accounts, communications. You might find something that offends your sense of order." That got Wolfe's attention. His eyes opened, sharp now. "Leave the files. I shall consider whether my offense justifies participation." Denning nodded, set down a sealed envelope, and left with a politeness that felt rehearsed. The sound of the front door closing echoed like the end of a bad overture. I picked up the envelope. "So, you're actually going to help them?" "Help?" Wolfe said, scowling. "No, I'm going to verify the accuracy of their incompetence. If this operation persists, it is not through the cleverness of bureaucrats." I opened the envelope and spread out the contents: bank statements, coded telegrams, and 2 photographs. One was of Devereaux at a wine gala. The other was grainy, showing a man boarding a ship under a false name. Wolfe's gaze fixed on that second photo. "Archie," he said, "look closely at the sleeve of the man's coat. I did. A small pin glinted in the photograph, barely visible, but distinct. A crest? I asked. Yes, Wolfe said. The emblem of the Arcadian Club. That's uptown. Expensive, private, and full of men who think ethics is a garnish. Precisely. Find out which member has recently traveled to Lisbon, Montreal, or Marseille. I suspect we shall discover our Lionel among them. I knew that tone. It was the one that meant I wasn't getting dinner until I'd earned it. By early evening, I had a list, 4 members with recent overseas trips. 2 were legitimate importers, 1 a retired diplomat, and 1 a name that hit like a cork, popping under pressure. Charles Harriman. I showed Wolfe the report. Looks like our dead fraud had more frequent flyer miles than we thought. He nodded grimly. Harriman did not die of remorse, Archie. He was silenced. Vale's murder, Harriman's suicide attempt, both orchestrated by the same hand. The financier protected himself by pruning liabilities. So who's left? I asked. Wolfe's gaze moved to the window. Anton Devereaux's name still circulates in those accounts, which means someone is using his identity. Impersonation. Resurrection, Wolfe said. The final deception. The dead are the best cover, Archie. They never contradict. The telephone rang then, sharp against the silence. I answered. Kramer's voice was tense. Goodwin, tell Wolfe this isn't over. Someone just withdrew $50,000 from Devereaux's account this afternoon. Signature verified. Photograph matched. The clerk swears it was him. I looked at Wolfe, who had gone perfectly still. Kramer, I said slowly, you're sure about that? Positive, he said. Either your client came back from the dead, or someone wants us to think he did. When I hung up, Wolfe's eyes were half-lidded, thoughtful but dark. Archie, he said softly, prepare the car. That nearly made me drop the phone. The car, you're leaving the house? He gave a slow, thin smile. Yes, Archie. If the dead have learned to sign checks, it seems even I must rise from my chair. And that was when I knew. The case of the tainted wine wasn't over. It had only decanted. I drove the Heron through the damp evening streets, watching Manhattan lights smear against the windshield like smudged gold. Wolfe sat beside me, his bulk filling most of the passenger seat, and his silence filling the rest. It wasn't often he left the brownstone. Only compulsion or outrage could move him that far. Tonight it was both. He said nothing until we reached the bank on Madison Avenue where Devereaux's phantom had risen from the dead. 2 uniforms were waiting, nervous about letting in a man who made federal agents sweat. Wolfe presented a curt nod, which in his language meant, proceed or perish. Inside, the air smelled of waxed floors and anxiety. A branch manager, pale, flustered, smelling faintly of aftershave and guilt, hurried over. Mr. Wolfe, Inspector Kramer said you'd be coming. This way, please. We followed him to a small office where a single security reel flickered on a screen. He pressed play. There, as clear as daylight, was Anton Devereaux, or someone wearing his face. The man moved slowly, confidently, producing identification that matched Devereaux's records, signing forms with his steady hand, collecting an envelope from the teller's window. Wolfe leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Freeze it. The image froze mid-motion. Wolfe pointed to the man's right hand. Archie. I bent closer. The hand was elegant, deliberate, but the ring was wrong. Devereaux's signet, which I'd seen countless times, bore his initials in gold script. This one was reversed, as though struck from a mirrored engraving. Forgery, Wolfe murmured. But not merely of appearance. This was orchestration. He rose then, slowly like a mountain uncoiling, and turned to the manager. You will provide me with the signature specimen taken today, and the transaction log. The manager fumbled. But Mr. Wolfe, the Bureau... Will receive them from me, Wolfe said. his tone like iron wrapped in velvet. At once, the man scurried out. Wolfe turned to me. We return home. The final piece is within reach. I didn't argue. When Wolfe speaks with that kind of calm, it's because the storm's already broken inside his head. Back at the brownstone, Fritz had set out a platter of roast pheasant, which went ignored, a crime against civilization if ever there was one. Wolfe went straight to the office, motioned for me to close the door, and unfolded the signature card. He studied it under the lamplight, lips moving slightly. "Archie," he said finally, "fetch the Devereux correspondence we retained from the first day. The note he left with the sample case." I dug it out of the files. He compared the two side by side, the new signature and the old one. At first glance, they were identical. Then Wolfe's finger touched the flourish of the A. "Observe," he said. "The curvature here is reversed. Mirror writing, habitual in left-handed persons trained to disguise their script. Devereux was right-handed." I blinked. "So our ghost left-handed banker is—" "The same man who arranged the smuggling," Wolfe said softly. "Richard Vale." I stared. "Impossible. He's dead. Archie, I am weary of your faith in mortality. Vale did not die in Montreal. The body was his accomplice. A decoy. Lydia Devereux arranged his escape, believing she could save him. He repaid her with poison, then took her identity for cover, moving the funds under her uncle's name. A man who kills his sister has already abandoned humanity." I whistled low. "So the living dead are alive and cashing checks?" "Yes, and quite possibly armed with another passport by now." He leaned back, eyes glinting under the lamplight. But Vale made one final error. He sought to outwit bureaucracy, not conscience. He reappeared where procedure would recognize him, not where morality would condemn him. That, Archie, is his undoing. As if on cue, the phone rang. I picked it up. "Goodwin." Kramer's voice rumbled through the line. "We've got your ghost. Guy matching Devereux's description just tried to board a freighter at Pier 32. Had a briefcase full of foreign securities. He didn't get far." I glanced at Wolfe. "He's listening," I said. "Tell him," Kramer growled. "Next time he decides to resurrect someone, warn me first." I hung up and turned to Wolfe. "You know, if you ever do die, Kramer's gonna dig you up just to check your pulse." Wolfe's expression didn't change. I expect he'll be disappointed either way. The rest was routine, statements, verification, the federal man returning to collect what Wolfe had already deduced hours earlier. Denning arrived just after dusk, face grim but respectful. "You were right. The man posing as Devereux was Richard Vale. He confessed before the Bureau took him away." Wolfe merely inclined his head. "Confession," he said, "is the coward's shortcut to absolution." Denning hesitated. He said something else, too. Said you'd understand. That deception, like wine, improves with patience. Wolfe's lip curled. He was wrong. Deception, like wine, spoils if left open to air. Denning left without another word. I closed the door behind him and turned to Wolfe, who had already sunk into his chair like a man returning to his rightful throne. "So that's it," I said. "Vale alive. Caught. Case closed. You've dragged one more ghost out of the cellar." He nodded, eyes half closed. "It is done." Fritz entered then with 2 glasses and a fresh bottle of Burgundy. Wolfe poured carefully, the crimson liquid catching the lamplight like truth distilled. He handed me 1 glass and raised his own. "To justice?" I offered. "No," Wolfe said softly. "To restraint. Justice is the last indulgence of the guilty." I took a sip, feeling the warmth slide down like quiet vindication. Outside, the city hummed, the same indifferent rhythm it always had. Inside, the brownstone exhaled, its order restored. After a long silence, Wolfe said, "Archie, do you know why I despise wine fraud above all else?" Because it's bad for business. Because, he said, it corrupts both nature and man. One adulterates the grape, the other the soul, and both insist the flavor is improved. I smiled. You ever think you're too poetic for your own good? He took another slow sip. Not poetic, Archie. Precise. Fritz appeared in the doorway again, announcing that dinner was served. Braised veal, truffle sauce, and buttered leeks. Wolfe stood, as if the weight of the case had finally lifted. Finally, he said, something untainted. I followed him into the dining room, the smell of Fritz's cooking chasing away the last traces of deceit that had lingered like stale smoke. Wolfe took his seat, unfolded his napkin, and with the faintest gleam of satisfaction said, "Archie, please remind me tomorrow to send the Bureau an invoice for emotional damages." I grinned. "Will do. And how should I itemize that? Psychological inconvenience or unwanted physical exertion?" He gave me the look, half disdain, half reluctant amusement. Both. Dinner began, the house settled, and the city outside rolled on, unaware that truth had once again been wrung out of lies by a man who hated motion but mastered reason. When I turned out the office light later, the empty glass on his desk still caught a hint of red in the dark, like the last drop of a mystery finally drained. And that, as Nero Wolfe would say, was that, 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 was that.